Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. In this discussion, we're going to address a question that was brought to my attention by a student in terms of the fact that we keep using terms like overfat and overfatness and fatness and fitness, and we never actually go about addressing what are we actually talking about when we talk about this idea about a continuum between fitness and fatness, and how does it actually relate to our overall health. When we start looking at the idea about obesity and the way in which we talk about obesity and the way in which we talk about fatness, we tend to think about it in terms of the body composition, the amount of body fat, but that's not the real issue here. The real issue is the health status that comes about due to any level of fatness and the impact that that level of fatness has on my normal physiological responses. And it's that change that we see in terms of this normal physiological responses that is going to be, that is addressed whenever we talk about any of the lifestyle interventions that we have as relates to health, or the lifestyle interventions as relates to diet and nutrition and exercise in terms of reversing overall health status. So, fitness, fatness, the fitness and fatness continuum. What is that? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
So most of the information that is going to be discussed here came out or comes out from one of my very early publications in terms of the continuum of fitness and fatness as it relates to overall health and the impact that diet and exercise has on health. While many talk about the issues of obesity and many talk about the issues of overfat or fatness as it relates to the concept of body image or body fat, which we've talked about previously, in terms of, is it truly an idea about body fatness? Is it truly an idea about body composition? Is it truly the idea about body image as it relates to what we mean when we talk about obesity? With the understanding that obesity is nothing more than the BMI metric. And while we have to be very careful about using BMI in terms of its impact on addressing health status, the real issue that we have to address here is the health status of the individual who happens to be overfat. It's not the appearance of excessive fatness. It's not whether or not we actually see if we actually see obesity being measured. What we're really talking about is we're talking about how does excessive fatness or the limitations of fatness impact the health status for the individual? And can we equate the changes of fatness to actual physiological issues that we see as it relates to the various types of pathologies that we see, whether it's eating pathologies or physical activity pathologies, or if it's some sort of change in lifestyle that leads to any type of disease status that we think about. Limitations in physical activity, limitations in diet have impacts, as we've talked about, as relates to establishing poor health status. And it's the individual with poor health status that tend to have a body image or a body weight that tends to lean towards high fat. However, it's not always the case where if I happen to have high fat, I happen to have a health status issue. Or if I'm excessively lean, that means I have a high fitness, or I have very low health status issues, or I don't have a high likelihood of having diseases. That's why it's important to be aware of the totality of the issues that come into existence as it relates to individual differences in fatness and how overfat and overfatness can lead to issues, especially if you wish to better understand how diet, exercise, and the combinations of diet and exercise can be used for improving health and health status for the individual or changing body compositions for the individual. But more importantly, understanding that we can get changes in health status without having changes in body composition. And this is where we have to keep in mind that there's a continuum of health status for everyone. This continuum of health status is based off the interaction of a host of factors that we've talked about previously, and these factors coming into play that lead to total levels of fatness relative to total levels of fitness, that we can cause or that we can alleviate issues of health based off of the stresses that take place within the cells, within the tissues for someone who is overfat. When we talk about overfat and overfatness, what we're talking about is we're talking about a high level of body fat, not necessarily a high level of visible body fat, but high levels of body fat, particularly the visceral body fat, where when we have elevated levels of fatness, we tend to have a deterioration in health status. This high level of fatness, even though we want to think about it in terms of having somebody be obese or having somebody be visibly high fat mass, it's not always that case. It has to deal with inactivity and sedentary lifestyle combined with poor food choices that lead to elevated levels of inflammation. It's within this idea, we have this continuum that gets developed, and the continuum that gets developed goes from having a very poor health status, a high level of fatness, to a very good health status, a high level of fitness, in which we have this kind of cascade of events or a cascade of progress taking place, where we have someone that is highly inactive going to someone that is sedentary, going to someone that is active but expresses overfatness, to someone who is active but starts to express fitness, to someone who's highly active and expresses fitness. Where when we're on the inactive and sedentary side of the continuum, we have increasing risks for disease. We have increasing risks for disease because we have high fatness factors and low fitness factors. Whereas we start moving towards the continuum of the highly active and fit individual, we start having a reduction in the risk for disease. And this reduction in risk for disease comes about because instead of having low fitness factors, we now have high fitness factors. And instead of having high fatness factors, we now have low fatness factors. And there's an actual point within this continuum where we have an inversion, where we have a change in relative level of health status. And that's at the active overfatness level. And this is where we had this kind of idea of the fit but fat or fat but fit kind of idea here. And this continual responses for health for everyone is based off of how we can go about looking at the various types of hormones that come into play that are going to change overall level of health, overall level of disease in terms of that. Am I going to alleviate health issues or am I going to cause health issues in terms of disease status or poor health status? The idea here is that we need to worry about not necessarily the overweight or the obese individual. We have to worry about the overfat individual. That is someone that is on the inactive side of the continuum, where we have high fatness factors and low fitness factors. And the reason why we have to do this is because of the fact that not all fat is equal and not all sedentary behaviors are equal. And so when we start discussing this idea about overfat or fatness, and overfatness in terms of causing the disease issues and it not necessarily being overweight or being obese, it's because not all fat is equal. There are two distinct types of fat masses that we have to worry about. And we tend to lump sum everything together when we start looking at this idea about obesity or about overfatness. The first one that we talk about in terms of fat mass is the ornamental or the subcutaneous fat. The other type of fat that we talk about is what's referred to as the visceral fat. When we start looking at these two types of fats, they're going to have different types of metabolic effects in terms of what they do for the body. All of the fat masses will have some sort of metabolic determinant in terms of what it's going to do hormonally. For the longest period of time, we've always thought about fat simply in terms of fuel, in terms of quote unquote energy for the body. that it's somehow just this inert mass that we carry around because we are, put quotes around this, eating more calories than we're burning. Even though, as we've talked about previously, we don't gain or lose weight based off of calories and the fact that calories are never burned. It's the idea here within these two types of fat masses where we have to worry more about the visceral fat than the subcutaneous or ornamental fat as relates to this overfatness issue within this continuum of fitness and fatness. Where people who have high visceral fat, regardless of what they look like, are going to be on that overfat side of this fitness and fatness continuum. And it's not simply because they're storing fat, storing lipids within the adipose tissues of the body, within the fat tissues of the body. It's because the visceral adipose tissue has this ability to function as an endocrine tissue, to function as a hormone producing tissue, just like all the other tissues in the body. But the hormones that they're producing are going to have a negative impact on my metabolism and a negative impact on my overall levels of inflammation. It's going to cause more inflammation taking place. It's going to cause a dysregulation within inflammation process. It's the regulatory process that we see in terms of this inflammation dysregulation that leads to the health issues that get experienced by the individual who's overfat. And it's that inflammation dysregulation that gets linked to prolonged inflammatory issues, prolonged immune issues that cause even more adipose tissue, even more fat mass to be accumulated, which causes even greater amounts of inflammation to take place, which causes metabolic dysregulation to occur. It's that metabolic dysregulation that comes about from the hormones linked to this excessive fatness, linked to this overfatness, that lead to the reduction in health. Now, we want to kind of blame something. It's the easiest way of doing this. We want to try to do an Occam's razor issue here. But the problem is that it's, and as we've talked about previously, it's an excessively complex issue where health itself, the ability to develop health, is a highly intricate web of factors that are all interconnecting with each other, where it functions very similar to an engine where you have all these cogs spinning around that will ultimately lead to overall health status for the individual. While the factors that are going to come into play are important, it's the hormones that are going to be regulating how those factors are interacting with each other that is going to lead to expressions of health status that will either make me healthy, high fitness, low fatness, or make me unhealthy, high fatness, low fitness. And it's that continuum that we're going to see that's going to come into play is based off of how we get changes in the hormones, where the interaction is going to come about, leading to changes in antagonistic responses in that fitness and fatness continuum, where we're going to have changes in fitness that should help to improve overall health status, lower disease state, lower disease risk, or changes in fatness issues that will lead to a diminished health status, a high diseased status. Within that, we do have that continuum, that reversal point within the continuum, based off of how physical activity is going to impact the negative signals coming from fatness by elevating certain levels of fitness. And it's all based off of how the changes in the hormones are coming into play and how those changes in hormones are going to lead to the positive impact we want to see within this continuum. This continuum where we see linkages in hormone levels, in changes in hormone sensitivities, that's going to exist based off of the total level of fatness relative to the total level of fitness. High total levels of fatness with low total levels of fitness is typically identified with having lifestyle diseases, metabolic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndromes, cancers, and it occurs from an increase in the total fat tissue accompanied with reduction in total lean body tissue that changes the hormone signals leading to that diseased state. It's the disease state that is developed by the increasing inflammation hormones and reduction in the anti inflammation hormones, as well as a reduction in the anabolic hormones that lead to that diseased status. Which means that when we look at being over fat, what we're basically looking at is we're looking at someone who has a long standing chronic inflammatory disease. The physiological responses that we see will lead to many of the metabolic issues that we usually talk about as relates to somebody being quote unquote obese. But it's not necessarily about being obese or having obesity that's going to cause these changes. It's about that chronic level of inflammation. That is where we look at, we start talking about this idea about fatness within this fatness and fitness continuum. The physiological responses will lead to that metabolic issues, along with a variety of changes in the genetic expression of the cells that make the cells less responsive to anabolic responses, that can cause differential changes within cells that can lead to a number of epigenetic issues as well as genetic issues, not just for the person, but also for their offspring. This is where we can get generational changes within distinct types of metabolic genes. This is where we will see passing of metabolic issues to children and to grandchildren based off of the changes that we see within the individual based off of their level of fitness and fatness. And we usually see it with people that have expression of overfatness more than expression of overfitness. And this is where what ends up happening is that as we start seeing that movement towards the fatness side of the continuum, the high sedentariness, the inactivity, the poor choice in dietary intake, we end up seeing a reduction in our anabolic hormones. We see an increase in visceral fat. We see a reduction in fat-free mass. We see a change or a differentiation in the type of cells that we're seeing within the adipose tissue, as well as a change in the types of fats in circulation. The change that comes about from the adipose tissue, the change that comes about from the fat cells, leads to a change in the hormone signals coming away from those fat cells. Most notable of those are going to be things like adiponectin, visfatin, leptin, resistin, retinol binding protein 4 or RBP4, as well as a couple of key inflammatory signals such as tumor necrosis factor or TNF alpha, as well as interleukin 6. All of those are going to have impacts on the way in which macrophages, the way in which immune cells are being activated. It's also going to have changes in how sensitive we are to distinct hormones such as insulin, such as glucagon, such as GLPs, the GLP-1 being the most famous of the GLPs, such as GIP. Hormones that have become more popular, if you want to think about in terms of popularity, based off of the recent use of diabetic medicines in weight control, where some of them will have positive fitness impacts like adiponectin, which will increase insulin sensitivity and reduce inflammatory responses, while others will have a negative impact, such as leptin, which is going to increase vascular adhesions, increase inflammatory responses, increase activation of macrophages, change the willingness to have a satiation response, change our hunger responses, independent of any type of fuel utilization or energy balance utilization. At the same time, we'll see changes within other hormones coming away from other tissues that are not from the fats, not from the fat cells, not from the adipose tissue. We'll see changes in steroid hormones, testosterone or androgens, estrogen, cortisol. where we're going to see a swing towards having higher levels of cortisol and lower levels of androgens and lower levels of testosterone, which is also associated with an increase in the binding proteins for those steroids, particularly for testosterone and androgens, which limits anabolic responses within the tissues, which limits the ability to build fat-free mass, which leads to greater accumulation of fat mass and higher levels of inflammation. This is where we basically have this kind of vicious positive feedback loop feeding in, where we will constantly be having greater amounts of inflammation, and the greater amounts of inflammation is going to lead to other changes within the stress hormones, which causes even greater amounts of inflammation and leads to this chronic instability that we have within our responsiveness to the correct hormones, where we end up getting a dysregulation in terms of hormonal responses. One of the things that we start seeing is we will also start seeing changes in some of the hormones that are linked with our basal metabolic rates. We'll start seeing a reduction in our basal metabolic rates. We'll start seeing a reduction in growth hormones. We'll start seeing a change in thyroid hormones. We'll start seeing changes in a lot of the pancreatic hormones. We'll start seeing a lot of changes in growth factors. We'll see a lot of changes in ischemic factors, which are all necessary in order to maintain normal metabolic functions. All of these changes lead to changes in metabolic expression, and this change in metabolic expression limits my ability to utilize various types of fuel sources. It makes me go into what we call physiologically as a glucose sparing event. This glucose sparing event is going to lead to ever increasing levels of glucose within the bloodstream, and the increasing levels of glucose in the bloodstream is what's going to trigger additional inflammatory signal responses, which is going to cause, once again, within that positive cascade of responses, greater amounts of inflammation. We also see changes in terms of responsiveness to hormones based off of changes in the receptors for the hormones at different areas of the body, where we will start seeing that with ever increasing levels of fatness, we will start seeing insulin insensitivity. We'll start seeing leptin insensitivity. We'll start seeing changes in adiponectin levels. We actually start seeing a drop in adiponectin. We will also start seeing changes in thyroid hormone production and thyroid hormone responsiveness. We will also start seeing changes in growth hormone and growth hormone responsiveness, where if we start to, instead of stay highly sedentary, highly inactive, high levels of fatness factors, if we can get out of that, if we can start becoming more active, what ends up happening is we're able to change some of that stress response, some of that changes in the stress hormones, some of that changes within the inflammatory hormones, where instead of being metabolically inflexible, instead of being stuck in that glucose sparing event, where the body wants to use multiple types of fuels, but the body is unable to use multiple types of fuels, it's stuck where it can't use the fuels that it needs to use, which is going to make me have high levels of fatigue, both subjectively as well as objectively. Fatigue will set in very quickly, which is going to make me not want to be physically active. However, if I'm able to start becoming more physically active, I'm able to kind of flip that whole kind of cascade of events. However, I'm still relatively inactive. This is where we have these interactions of all of those signals within the overfatness state, leading to that diseased state, where what ends up happening is I start getting a high amount of pro-inflammatory responses and a low amount of anti-inflammatory responses. The high amount of pro-inflammatory responses combined with the expression of metabolic issues is what is going to lead to a lot of the metabolic diseases that we think about, a lot of the non-communicable diseases that we think about. The cardiovascular disease, the diabetes everybody thinks they have, the obesity issues that we like to think about in terms of this overfatness idea, the body dysregulation, the anabolic dysregulation. All of that leads into the overfatness and the health status issues. the complexity of the interactions that are taking place between all of those hormones. The complexity of it leads to various causes for concern for people who happen to express the fatness side of the continuum at high amounts, the overfat. The overfatness comes about not simply because of overconsuming foods or overconsuming calories. It comes about due to that inflammatory response. And this is where we have to kind of create a little bit of disconnect in terms of what's going on in terms of the health status for the individual. It's not about calorie in, calorie out. It's not even about nutrient in, nutrient out. It's not even about nutrient utilization when we're looking at this fitness and fatness idea. What we're looking at is we're looking at this kind of complex interweb of various factors that are going to cause changes in hormonal signals. And those changes in hormonal signals is what's going to lead to the diseased health status, the overfatness. This is where people will start talking about, oh, the person lives in a food desert where they have a high density of fast food restaurants with very little in terms of supermarket or in terms of areas to get, quote, fresh food, where they are not in a good walking environment where where you have to drive to everywhere, where there is very little play area, where there's very little parks, where we have these kind of ideas about the availability of stuff being there, all being triggers to this kind of obesity issue where we want to, once again, look at the very easy aspect of this and blame fast food. And it's not about fast food. It's not about the type of food you eat. It's not with the exception of the idea of the metabolic disruptors that are sometimes found in foods, particularly in the ultra processed foods, which we've talked about previously. Yes, those can have an impact, but it's not a blame thing there. Because when we're looking at this overfatness issue, what we're really talking about is we're talking about within that continuum of fitness and fatness, am I overexpressing inflammation? And it's the overexpression of inflammation that is going to be the cause for all of the health issues that we talk about when we talk about overfatness. It's not about the food we eat. It's not about the environment that we live in, with the exception of the disruptors that might be there or the toxins that might be there. The complex interactions that we see in the development of fatness and the development of fitness within the health issues that are present for people who are over fat appear to come through a number of underlying factors, all interacting with each other, like we've talked about previously, that are all influenced by each other and interact on each other. Familial influences, environmental influences, social factors, all causing changes to my behavior. My hormonal influences, my genetic influences, all causing changes to my physiological factors. My health behavior influencing my hormonal behavior, which influences my genetic behavior, which influences my genetic factors, which is going to cause changes to my physiological factors. That health behavior is going to interact with the physiological factors as relates to my body composition, the relationship between fat mass and fat-free mass. And then within that fat mass, what type of fat mass am I going to be accumulating? Is it going to be subcutaneous fat mass, or is it going to be visceral fat mass? It's that visceral fat mass that we have to worry about, because that's the fat mass that is going to be predominantly causing a lot of this inflammatory response that can have a negative impact on my overall health. It's kind of foolhardy to stipulate that it's a single factor or a single distinct gene that's going to be the ultimate cause for fatness or the ultimate cause for fitness and any type of resultant health issue coming from those. What we need to do is we need to look at how the various factors are going to interact with each other. It's going to influence all of my health behaviors. And this is where we've talked about previously in terms of the self-selection, self-motivation versus the coercion. Choosing fitness choosing diet that you want to do that's going to move me towards the fitness side of that fitness and fatness continuum and away from the fatness side of the fitness and fatness continuum. That's going to cause a reversal in the hormonal regulations that are being disrupted by the excessive amounts of fatness, by the excessive amounts of inflammation, where I'm going to be able to reconstitute and reestablish anabolic regulation as opposed to the anabolic dysregulation that we see with the fatness issues. Those who have expression of excessive fatness, those that have limited fitness, undergo alterations in their physiological responses that is best described as being anabolic dysregulation. Anabolic dysregulation is simply meaning that we either underproduce the hormones that are going to be building the fat-free masses, or we do not respond to the hormones that are supposed to be building the fat-free masses. Because of that, we get an impaired stress and inflammatory response. It's that impaired stress and inflammatory response that act cyclically to progressively induce additional dysregulation. Once again, it's functioning off of a positive feedback loop. Stress triggers responses, which will trigger additional stresses, which will trigger additional responses, which causes more inflammation. And all of these responses are an attempt to get rid of the initial stress that's there. But the problem is that because of the increasing levels of visceral adipose tissue, we get signals that do not allow us to eliminate the additional stresses. And this is where people say, oh, you just cut how much you eat and you'll start losing weight. Yeah, you can cut what you eat and lose weight, but just because you're losing weight doesn't mean you're going to be losing the visceral adipose tissue that is causing the overfatness issues. And this is where we have to establish the correct parameters within the exercise stimulus I'm using, the nutrition that I'm following, the level of adiposity and the type of adiposity, how much fat I have and what type of fat I have, the psychological approach that I have to what I'm doing and my general level of psychological stress. There are other factors that we have no power over changing, and that includes things like my age and my biological sex. And that's because the age and the biological sex is going to cause changes in how the hormones are being produced and the responsiveness to hormones based off of changes that we see. If I get this anabolic dysregulation, I reach a diseased health status. And it's that diseased health status that we're looking at whenever we're talking about overfatness. It's the impact on the physiological responses and the health status that comes about from the physiological responses due to the changes in all of the signals interfering with normal anabolic responses. Where we get this kind of reverberation of signals that are going to influence how I go about behaving, that's going to influence the cellular responses within my body, which is going to influence my behaviors, which is going to influence my cellular functions, which is going to influence my behaviors. The principal interactions that we see here and the principal impact that we're going to have that relates to overfatness is seen through the interactions of the things that I can change with the things that I cannot change. And it's going to lead to the health status that is typically thought about as having metabolic dysregulation or metabolic syndrome, most notably referenced as having diabetes. Even though we have to look at things like cardiovascular disease, things like neurodegenerative disease, things like cancers as being metabolic syndromes. The changes in cell and changes in tissue responses are coupled with the changes in psychological factors, psychological influences, the self-selection towards distinct behaviors, which is going to lead to either greater use of behaviors or lesser use of behaviors. And this is where we have to make sure that when we're trying to influence other people's behaviors, we have to allow them to self-select towards behaviors and we cannot ridicule for not choosing the behavior that we want them to choose. If we do not get self-selection towards appropriate health behaviors, appropriate behaviors that are going to influence a increase in fitness factors, we can lead to an avoidance of behaviors. And this is where coercion is not the line of thought we want to use when we're trying to influence choices in behaviors. We want them to select the behaviors in such a way so that it becomes a natural want for the person to do what is of benefit for them. The unfortunate thing is that because of the social stigma that we have towards distinct exercises that the people who are trying to, quote, lose fat are supposed to do, we tend to increase the level of coercion and increase the likelihood of aversion and avoidance of behavior. It's the innate dislike towards distinct coercive behaviors that leads to lower than desirable levels of exercise stimulus and lower levels of nutrition follow through. That result, that interaction of avoidance and aversion can help explain why there are very few that can achieve recommended dosages of activity following the end of long-term use of coercive behaviors, coercive exercise programs to alter health. They do it when they're being forced to do it, but once they stop being forced to do it, they stop doing it. And when they stop doing it, because of changes in hormonal signals and changes in responses to distinct patterns of hormone responses, the likelihood of having yo-yoing coming into play is very high. The selected exercise that we want needs to be appropriate for the desired changes. And this is where the social stigma for exercise towards the choice being endurance exercise can actually lead to the avoidance for all exercise, because the overfat individual, regardless of what their body type looks like, do not feel endurance exercise the same way that the fit individual feels endurance exercise. And then what we end up doing is we end up coupling that low exercise stimulus with poor nutrition. This is where we think about in terms of, oh, you're going to have the high caloric diet, but it's not really a high caloric diet. It's diets that are excessive in ultra processed food or just processed food in general, that have a large amount of metabolic disruptors or have high amounts of fructose within them, high amounts of sugar, fructose sugar within them, that accentuates the changes towards the inflammation side of the continuum, the increase the amount of fatness signaling that takes place. And this basically takes us into that downward spiral that leads to the disease, where the tissues, the lean body tissues, the lean body mass, the fat-free mass, will not maintain itself properly. And this is where we will see a loss of skeletal tissue, a loss of skeletal muscle tissue. The limiting signals for other tissues result in elevated levels of inflammation, elevated levels of tissue breakdown, and increased likelihood of disease, increased likelihood of sickness coming about. That comes about because of that constant state of inflammation. The concept that we're looking at in terms of this continuum of health status is where we see within that continuum of fitness and fatness, the fatness side being the disease side due to poor adherence to physical activity plans, poor adherence to exercise programs, poor diet and nutrition follow through, the increase in sedentary behaviors that will lead to initial inflammatory responses that initiate additional inflammatory responses that will eventually lead to the point where inflammation will interfere with the cell's ability to respond to the hormones that are necessary to maintain itself. fail to respond to insulin, fail to respond to growth hormone, fail to respond to testosterone, fail to respond to any of the other anabolic hormones that lead to anabolic dysregulation. It's that idea about the dysregulation, the anabolic dysregulation, that leads to the health issue, that leads to health issues of insulin and leptin resistance, adiponectin insufficiency issues, poor cardiovascular and metabolic and poor, poor cardiovascular and metabolic functions, poor musculoskeletal health. And in some cases, actually can lead to sex hormone production deficiencies and sex efficiency diminishments, can lead to sexual performance issues. For men, can lead to erectile dysfunction issues, can lead to hypogonadal issues, can lead to polycystic ovarian issues for women, can lead to issues in terms of fertility for both men and women. The idea of overfatness and health issues is linked to the anabolic dysregulation that does not occur because of the caloric imbalance, does not occur because you're eating more food than what you should be eating or eating more calories than what you should be eating. Even though, as we've talked about previously, it's not about calories, it's about nutrition balance in terms of that weight issue. The issue here is because overfat and sedentary behaviors, inflammation, lead to the anabolic dysregulation. In the anabolic dysregulation, the combination of the anabolic dysregulation with the high amounts of inflammation, the insulin and leptin resistance that we see within tissues, that leads to the inability to use the appropriate fuel sources for the activities that we're doing, which leads to the metabolic inflexibility, which leads to poor tissue maintenance, which leads to increasing levels of glucose within the bloodstream, which triggers additional inflammation because of activation on immune cells that occur during the glucose sparing events, simply because of high amounts of glucose in circulation, which leads to the association of overfatness and what most people refer to as obesity and diabetic conditions. The tissue's limited responsiveness to the signals, in particular insulin, is what is going to lead to the high amounts of glucose in the bloodstream and the potentiation or the probability for having a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. For people who are predisposed to neurodegenerative diseases, that insulin insensitivity can lead to what is now referenced as type 3 diabetes, or the neurodegenerative diseases that are associated with things like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, just to name a few. And it's all based off of that inflammation shift within metabolism and the reduction in responsiveness to insulin that occurs because of the shift for inflammation. The interferences that we see with insulin signaling causes even less uptake of glucose and causes even more imbalance in energetic hormones, in hormones that should be regulating our normal metabolic rates, which cause us to have even greater reductions in basal metabolic rates that get coupled with accumulation of lipids within the body that trigger even additional inflammation to take place. This is where we start seeing the hallmark signs and symptoms of type 2 diabetes taking hold. Type 2 diabetes itself is a symptom of this overfatness. It is not a disease in itself. It is not a disease caused by increasing consumption of sugar by itself. It's due to these changes in all of the regulatory elements that should be maintaining the body correctly that are no longer maintaining the body correctly, where we get this anabolic dysregulation occurring, where we will start seeing changes in all of the metrics that we want to see in terms of normal metabolic signals, in terms of normal cardiovascular signals. This is where we'll start seeing changes in blood vessel functions. This is where we'll start seeing atherosclerosis, the hardening or the stiffening of the arteries. This is where we'll start seeing hypertension issues. We'll start seeing high blood pressure issues based off of changes in signals that come about. This is why we have to think about all of these changes coming about as a change in hormonal responses due to where we lie within that continuum of fitness and fatness. Where if I'm in that high inactive state, where I'm in the overfatness state, where I have excessive fat factor signals, high inflammation signals, and low fitness signals, low anabolic signals, I'm going to have a diseased state. That's what we're talking. We're talking about overfatness. We're not talking about what does the person look like. We're talking about, do we have hormonal dysregulation, and that hormonal dysregulation leading to all of the issues that come about that get associated with somebody being quote unquote obese. This is where we have to look at the variability of responses that will allow us to differentiate between someone being healthy in terms of their health status and someone being unhealthy in terms of the health status. And it's independent of what the person looks like. So even though we're talking about overfat and overfatness, we're not talking about whether or not the person looks fat or not. We're not talking about what the person's body image happens to be. We're talking about the level of inflammation that is coming into play that is causing disruption and dysregulation to how the body should be maintained. The onset of the diseases that come from being on that overfatness side of the fitness and fatness continuum leads to the onset of lifestyle diseases that appear to be based on the duration of exposure to the increase in fatness concurrent with reduction in fitness, where any changes in the behaviors going towards the fitness side of the continuum will start to alleviate issues of fatness, where changes at any point in time can have long-lasting ramifications for the person. A reduction in beneficial early health behaviors tend to have a detrimental effect on overall health throughout the person's life. Where given enough time at low fitness and high fatness, we will get the anabolic dysregulation, we will get metabolic dysregulation, we will get quote unquote lifestyle diseases, metabolic diseases that we tend to spend a large amount of time and a lot of money trying to treat. It's the impact that the fatness side of the fitness and fatness continuum has on the individual's overall health that has the possibility of having impacts on future generations through changes in genetic regulators and changes in epigenetic regulators within the gametes, within the sperm and within the oocyte, what everybody calls the egg, in terms of forming the offspring. The impact on the genetic and epigenetic regulators on genes like the leptin receptor gene, on genes like the fatty acid oxidase gene, on genes like the myostatin gene, on genes like the PPAR genes like the agouti gene, genes like the ApoE gene, will all have long-lasting disease-linked responses, all due to elevated levels of inflammation stemming from high amounts of fatness within the fitness and fatness continuum. And so when we start looking at this fitness and fatness continuum, what we're basically saying is, where are we at in terms of the relationship between behaviors and activities that should elevate inflammation, fatness, and behaviors and hormonal responses that should be reducing inflammation, fitness. When we are towards the side of inflammation, we are experiencing overfatness. When we're experiencing low levels of inflammation, high levels of anabolic responses, we are experiencing fitness. And it's always within a continuum and it's always modulating itself. And what we want is we want to make sure that the vast majority of all of the signals that we have is going towards that fitness side of the continuum if we want to have health. A reduction in overall health comes from movement in the continuum towards the fatness side of the continuum, away from the fitness side of the continuum. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully, got a bit out of the conversation in terms of the continuum of fitness and fatness and how we go about describing this and why we use the terms that we are using whenever we were talking about this in any of the other podcasts or the YouTube videos or even any of the other written stuff. If you'd like to know more about the fitness and fatness continuums, please read any of the work that we've put out as relates to fitness and fatness and the fitness and fatness continuum. Please stay tuned for more information as relates to this idea in terms of how we can go about utilizing pro fitness, pro health behaviors in an attempt to reduce any of the impacts that we have in terms of the fatness signals. Please make sure you are giving us that big 5-star rating, that big thumbs up, telling us that we're doing a good job if you like what we're putting out there. Please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. Please make sure you are subscribing and following us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube. The written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we're posting to Instagram and into Threads. You have other topics you'd like us to discuss, please make sure you leave it to us in the comments. Please stay tuned for more talks on the misinformation, misconceptions that we have about how the human body works and what we can do in terms of trying to live a overall healthier life.